This was a pretty long module. I now want to wrap it up or bring it to an end by making this quiz a bit more realistic and showing different results based on which answers we chose. Now, of course, you could now make this extremely complex. I will make it relatively simple, though. What I want to do is I want to turn each answer here also into a map by wrapping it with curly braces. And then we'll, of course, have our text or answer text or whatever you want to name it. And now that's the important new thing. I want to assign a score to this answer because we have kind of a personality quiz here. So we can calculate an overall score of the personality of the person who takes our quiz. Now, let's say, and that's of course just my logic here, the higher the score, the more strange or negative a person is. And therefore, if you, for example, select black as your favorite color, I'll give you a score of 10. On the other hand here, for red, where then red is our text, we might go with a score of, let's say, 6. Or 5, because red is more positive than black, in my world at least. Now green is even more positive, because green is the color of hope. And of course, feel free to assign your own scores to fit your own personal judgment of these colors. But I'll give green a color of 3. And well, white is of course the color of innocence. So here for white, I'll actually give that a score of, let's say, 1. So with that, these are my answers. They're now all maps, not just text. They got a text key, but then they also got scores. Now, of course, we can do the same here for our animals. And I will now fast forward here. Of course, feel free to assign your own scores or take the ones you find attached. Attached, you basically find that questions list now with all my finished scores assigned. And we can then proceed with that. So with the finished list here, now of course, when I pass down my questions here into the quiz, inside of the quiz widget where I built these answer widgets, the answer I'm forwarding here is no longer just a string. That is incorrect. Instead, each answer I'm looking at is of course itself now a map. So we should change this. A map where we have a string key and then objects, various values, because we have in our answers, we have both text and we have numbers. So therefore, here when I map, answer now is also a map with various values. And therefore here, I'm of course interested in my text, in the answer text, which I know will be a string. But I will also need the score to calculate a total score, of course. Now, before we explore this global score, though, you might be getting an error here, and maybe also regarding this question text, though you would have gotten this early already. And you can solve these errors by simply adding as string thereafter to make it very clear to Dart which kind of data it can expect from accessing that key in that map. If you need as string or not depends on the Dart version you're using. It's not directly related to Flutter, but instead depends on Dart. In pubspec.yaml, if you have this environment SDK set to 2.12 or higher, then you need to add as string. I don't recommend setting this though. Instead, in order to follow along smoothly and still learn everything about Flutter without issues, you should set this to greater or equal 2.11. In that case, you can omit as string and you can follow along with the code shown in the course just fine and smoothly. But if you do have greater or equal 2.12, even though it's not recommended, you will need to add as string here. But now let's make sure we also calculate such a total score. And for that here, to answer question, so to that function which we have in the main Dart file, this underscore answer question function here, we actually need to get the score of the answer which was chosen. So I expect a score here as an argument, and this should be an integer, to calculate a total score. Hence, we should also add a total score, underscore total score, here, a total score property in our overall class. And then here, in answer question, I want to increase or add to the total score the score that we chose. So total score should be equal to total score plus score. By the way, if you have a setup like this, there also is a shortcut in Dart. Instead of using equal old value plus some new value, you can also have plus equal. And this will add this value to the old value before it then saves it back into that variable. So we add our score to the total score now in answer question. But now we have to make sure that in the quiz start file here, where we forward answer question to an answer, we actually make sure that we call answer question with the chosen score. And at the moment where we only point a reference, a pointer at that function, we're not doing that, because with just a pointer, we're not saying anything about the arguments that this function takes when it is called. And by default, Flutter will call it without any arguments, because we must not forget that our function here is bound to onPressed, and onPressed takes a function without arguments. So what do we do? In quiz start, where I build my answer widgets, where I forward that pointer at answer question, instead of forwarding this, I can forward an anonymous function. And here I use this one-line arrow function syntax, which I also showed you earlier. Now, by doing this, I create a function on the fly, and to the answer widget, I automatically only pass the address to that function. So that function is created on the fly, stored in memory, and instead of storing it in a variable, which then holds the address, which I could use here, I automatically get back the address. So I do get the address here, and I forward that address to answer. Now the thing is, therefore, my answer widget still gets a function which takes no arguments, right? That is an empty list, and that then does something. Now here, however, on the right side of the arrow here, I'm in the function body of that anonymous function. So here I no longer want to just use the address. Here I instead want to call answer question. Why? Because this is now not executed when Dart parses this. There it will only create this anonymous function and store it in memory. But this is now executed when onPressed is triggered, right? Because it's an anonymous function where I forward the address to answer. The address is then bound to the button here. So when the button is pressed, this address is used to then execute this anonymous function. So this function body here is only triggered when the button is pressed. Therefore, when it is pressed, I do want to call answer question. And now, since I call it here, I do have access to my answer map here, to my answer object, and therefore also to the score. Because every answer for which I'm looping here, or for which I'm going here, every answer is just a map with a text and a score. And now I can access that score here. So I can now forward answer score here to answer question. And I know that this will be an integer, and therefore answer question here will receive my integer score. Here it is. I hope this flow is clear. It's really just about passing function references around, and here we're creating such a function and therefore also such a function reference on the fly. It only gets executed when the button is pressed though, so when it is pressed, I of course want to execute this function in here. So with that, I can forward the score to my answer question function here in main, and I do increment the total score now. I now want to forward that total score to the result widget so that I can show different results there.